I want to thank you very much for participating today. Jacob, or Jack Ukeles, is president of Ukeles Associates and co-president of Jewish Policy and Action Research. Ukeles Associates was one of the first firms to focus on planning and management issues in the Jewish community. JPAR, the Jewish Policy and Action Research, has carried out 22 community population studies. Most recently completed studies are Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, and New York, are subject hence today, looking at the implications of those studies for the field of Jewish communal life. In the 1980s, Jack served in a number 2 position in the New York UJA Federation. In the 1970s, he was an active participant in the successful effort to restore New York City's financial and managerial health. That's when the city was going bankrupt under a beam, if you might remember. He has taught policy analysis and management at Columbia and at Penn, and was the founding chair of the Urban Policy Program at the New School University in New York City, holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, was a Fulbright scholar in India. Stephen M. Cohen is a research professor of Jewish social policy at HUC-JIR and director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archive at NYU Wagner. In 1992, he made Aliyah and taught for 14 years at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Arnold Isaac. He wrote The Jew Within, and with Charles Liebman Zal, he wrote Two Worlds of Judaism, The Israeli and American Experiences. His earlier books included American Modernity and Jewish Identity and American Assimilation or Jewish Revival. He was the lead researcher on the Jewish Community Study of New York, 2011, of course, working with Jack. In 2011 as well, he received an honorary doctorate from the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies. 2010, he received the Marshall Sklar Award of the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, the ASSJ, and was cited as one of the Forward 50, top 50 of American Jewry, that is. The book, Sacred Strategies, of which he is a co-author, won a National Book Award in 2010 and 2012. He was elected president of the Association for Social Scientific Study of Jewry.
My talk today, I call A Tale of Four Cities, learning about Jewish community, and probably should have said in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 studies, share some of the basic information, and then focus on some of what we call the big stories: Jewish engagement, Israel connections, economic and social vulnerability, and a couple of specific things that relate to one of the cities or the other, and some concluding comments. I'm going to share a lot of data, but I do want to not only give you the generalities, but show you the data that supports those conclusions. So we had a rare opportunity. We've done 22 studies, but they tend to be pretty spread out over time and space. We had a rare opportunity to do 4 major community studies in the same period. We use essentially the same methodology that we've been using since 1996, with some important incremental improvements. So we had a chance, and I gave an earlier version of this at the General Assembly of the federations, and it was a rare opportunity to put the data side by side. And what was quite remarkable is that people on the panel, each of whom were the vice president or senior person in each of the federations responsible for planning and for this study, they all sat there saying, wow, isn't this interesting? Because you never have a chance to put 4 communities side by side. So what are the 4 communities? Baltimore, Chicago 2010, Cleveland 2011, New York 2011. You see the numbers on interviews. These are all very large studies. The New York study is the largest study of Jews ever conducted outside the state of Israel, with only almost 6,000 completed interviews. So these 4 gave us an opportunity to do some comparisons, but keep in mind, this is not a representative sample of American Jewry. There are no small or medium-sized communities, and there are no Western or Southern communities in this group, and those communities tend to be very different. I come out of a perspective on the question of, are most American Jewish communities like each other or unlike each other? My answer is yes. They are both like each other and unlike each other. And when Stephen and I have debates about life and in American Jewish life, he tends to the macro, and I say, yeah, but, in Phoenix it's like this, and so on, it's just like that, and we're both right. There are also some modest differences, even though we all did the same study, one of the things we do when we do a study is it's highly tailored to the specific community, so that our questionnaires are not identical. They vary depending on the issue set that is current in that community at that point in time. One example of that is the last bullet. Chicago, which has been very diligent about doing a study virtually every 10 years for a very long time, was very eager to have a definition of who is a Jew that was comparable over time. And as Stephen will describe in his talk, the landscape of who is a Jew, the reality of who is a Jew, has changed dramatically in the United States, and we are dealing with a category which we never had before, of people who considered themselves partially Jewish. And in Chicago, those were left out of the published data, although they were interviewed. So some of the basic things we found. So first of all, the communities are quite different in size, ranging from 38,000 in Cleveland to almost 700,000 Jewish households with 1.5 million Jews in New York. Just so you have some relativity, New York is the largest Jewish community in the United States. LA is probably the second, though they haven't had a study for a very long time. Chicago is probably the third, depending on how you define some of the geographic areas of newer Western communities. Baltimore is the 14th largest. Cleveland is the 19th largest. These are all very important Jewish communities. When you talk about communities that are highly organized, the communities that come to mind in America are going to be Baltimore, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. These are in many ways the strongest Jewish communities, certainly from a federation perspective.
What does HH stand for?
Households. There are 3 measures of the size of the Jewish community. They're all equally important. They drive people nuts who are not in the business. We count households, that is to say, a household with at least one self-defined Jewish adult. We count Jewish persons, people who consider themselves Jewish. This is not a halachic standard. There are people who are not in the study who are halachic Jews and vice versa. And we count people in Jewish households, which includes non-Jews, spouses, children. So that's why those numbers are quite different. And if you're very quick, you can subtract the second row from the third row, and it tells you how many non-Jews there are in Jewish household. And we're not going to take time to do that. So when you put these communities side by side, the first thing that I noticed, which sort of surprised me when I stepped back, was that all 4 of these older, established Jewish communities have grown since their previous study. One had the right to expect, and there is a hypothesis of Jewish decline, which actually has some currency in Israel in some quarters, that the Jews in the diaspora are going away. And one has a right to expect that the largest, oldest, most established Jewish communities, the Jews are going away at the fastest rate. That's not true. Not true in these communities. It may be true, although I don't have the data, so I'm speculating. It may be true of smaller outlying communities. We have a lot of anecdotal information that smaller Jewish communities are in fact disappearing in the United States. And if there are losses, that's where they are. And some of the large communities are declining. But Miami has lost population, for example, and probably Philadelphia, all they changed definitions between their 2 studies, so it's a little hard to tell. But these cities have not lost population. When you look at the numbers, you see really very interesting patterns. So, for example, Baltimore has had a dramatic increase in the number of Jewish households, and a middling increase in the number of people in Jewish households, but almost no increase in the number of Jews, which is almost counterintuitive because Baltimore is a highly organized Jewish community with a very large Orthodox community, but it also has a relatively high intermarriage rate, which is fueling the people in Jewish households. On the other hand, it has a lot of household formation from the Orthodox Jewish community, which is fueling the increase in the number of households. And I'm not going to go through each one, but each one of these is quite different. New York, for example, the increases in number of households, Jews, and people are relatively similar. What's driving the increases in New York is an increase in the number of Jews, primarily the Orthodox population. And so even though New York's intermarriage rate is not low, it's not increased dramatically, and so you have a relatively stable pattern. Each one of these patterns is revelatory about something about these communities, even at this very gross level. The next thing is, when I put the age distribution up, it was something I really had to recheck because I could not believe how similar the age distribution was in these four cities. They are virtually identical. In every one of these four cities, about a fifth of the population is under 18, and another fifth is 65 or over, with the remainder in the middle. The differences are essentially within the range of, or very close to, statistical error, so they're essentially equal. Now, what's also interesting, when we do a community study, we very often compare the top row to the bottom row. Now, if you're looking at a retirement community in South Florida, or Palm Springs, where we did a study, the seniors number is going to dramatically exceed the number of under 18. We watch that as a kind of sign of community health. We have worked in communities, not necessarily these four, who are very worried about their future. And to them, if the percent of kids is dramatically lower than the percent of seniors, they know they're in trouble down the road. We have not found that in any of these four communities. Now, if you unpacked it, you would find out that the people who are having the kids are not necessarily the same people who are over 65. But from a community-wide perspective, the data is imbalanced. These are highly stable communities. That is to say, in all four communities, more than half of the respondents to the survey were born where they live, in Baltimore, Chicago, in each of those. So they're around over 50 to 60%, the top row in each one of these four sets of data. What is interesting, however, when you look at other places people come from, Baltimore, Cleveland, and Chicago function as magnets to the rest of the United States, and that's why the data is in bold. New York, which we as New Yorkers think of as a magnet, we're always running to young people who come there from elsewhere. On a proportional basis, the increases in the extent to which it's a magnet to the rest of the United States is dwarfed by the extent to which it's been a magnet to people coming from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And so you get, and also other foreigners. New York is still the main point of entry. This includes Israelis. I have a little bit on that later. New York is still the main point of entry on a relative basis for people who were born outside the United States. And again, we know anecdotally, when we work in smaller communities in the Midwest, they complain that all the young people are going to Chicago. RS is respondents and SP are spouses. That is to show you that the data is not identical. The questionnaires are slightly different in the different communities. So, for example, in Baltimore, it was all adults, and Chicago, but in Cleveland, we only asked the question of where were you born of respondents, and New York, respondents and spouses. One of the things about these studies today, is the average interview now is around 22 minutes on the telephone. We used to do 45 minutes. Okay. One of the other, a related question to where people born is the question of who's come recently. Again, you might, part of being a magnet means people keep coming. It wasn't just, in the case of New York, most of the Russians came in the 90s. They are not still coming. So New York could be a magnet for Russians, but that doesn't mean there are a lot of Russian-speaking newcomers. There are not. When you look at this data, first of all, in the range of and this again is respondents who've come, these are all respondents, all R's, who've come within the last 10 years, ranges from 6% in New York to 15% in Chicago, which was a little surprising. Chicago, if you want to think about current magnets, Chicago is the strongest magnet of any of these cities in terms of attracting people. But it's all within a range, and that they all have some newcomers, but this is these again are highly established, organized communities with very stable populations. So what are some of the big stories? In terms of what leadership in the United States is interested in, the number one subject still remains what we now call Jewish engagement, Jewish connections. And it's funny how the language has changed. We used to talk about Jewish continuity. Now we talked about renaissance or renewal. And now the language is connections and engagement. It's all about how do Jews connect to being Jewish, to Judaism, to the Jewish community. And underlying the interest is the fear that the young people are going away. And the fear about, for older people, about are their grandchildren going to be Jewish? The fear about community leadership, are we going to have leaders? Are we going to have people, the people of the community? We have done studies, not these, but others, specifically around the issue is, are all young adults going off the reservation? The data suggests that lots are, but not all are, and that's a much longer conversation. So Jewish engagement is the top issue for almost every study that we deal with. So what we find is that these communities, not surprisingly for people who know American Jewish community life, have relatively high overall levels of Jewish engagement. First of all, compared to the national study. The last national study of the Jews was 2000. There's a lot of effort to develop a current study. We're not sure how that's going to come out, but right now there is no current data. But when you look at the kinds of measures of Jewish engagement I'm going to show you and compare them to the data from the last study, almost all of this data, the positive data is higher and the negative data is lower. It's also higher than most other Jewish communities, but again, a lot of the effect of that is regional. Western and newer southern communities tend to be much less Jewishly engaged than the Midwest and Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic Jewish communities. But there's a significant but, and one that is actually of a lot of concern to leadership, and that there are groups that are consistently underengaged in Jewish life. We use anywhere, depending on the study, from 10 to 20 measures of Jewish engagement. I'll give you a few examples. The three groups that are most significantly disengaged are non-Orthodox young adults, intermarried households, and Jews with no religion. When we survey, we basically say, do you consider yourself Jewish, yes or no? Or now we say, or partially Jewish. Is your religion, what is your religion, if any? Judaism, none. If Judaism, what is your denomination? Conservative, Orthodox, Reform, vanilla chocolate, or none. And increasing numbers say no religion, and increasing numbers within Judaism say no denomination. Those patterns are consistent in direction, but not extent across different communities. And you'll see a couple of interesting variations on that. In general, Jews with no religion are relatively highly disconnected from Jewish life. The old-time, secular, committed Jews, which probably still exist in Israel, maybe in declining numbers, which exist to some extent in New York, which exist in Argentina, are essentially a rarity in the United States. The Yiddishists and the socialists and the Verband, all of those folks have essentially gone away. There are a few, there are some, and there are some who are interested in a revival, but outside of New York, and even in New York, we kept looking for them, and they are very few. It's a needle in a haystack in terms of what once was. In New York, in all of the cities that we've studied, people who say they have a religious denomination, I'm not saying what they do, but if they say they're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, or Reconstructionist, they are much more likely to be engaged in Jewish life than if they say they have no religion. And this is not about measuring the length of tzitzit, but that's the self-identification. Those labels go along. The other major finding in this area that I want to mention and illustrate is that the cost of being Jewish, which has been a theme on the national agenda of the United States Jewish community for a very long time. The data seems to suggest that cost does inhibit participation. So the first thing we found is that all four communities have relatively high levels of Jewish engagement. So these are some examples of some of the measures. How important is it to you to be Jewish? Probably the most fundamental measure of Jewish connection there is. The percentages tend to be very high. A significant percentage, if you notice, the New York percentage in the last column is lower. The other three are virtually identical. How important is it to be part of a Jewish community? We used to ask the Jewish community. Life is more complicated. Now we say a Jewish community. And again, that ranges about 45 to 50%. In intermarried households, are children being raised Jewishly or partially Jewish, which is the parentheses? Again, 30 to 50%. Chicago is very high, even though Chicago is the lowest on very important to be part of a Jewish community. So you see, there's a lot of, even though the patterns are similar, there are some interesting idiosyncratic differences, not all of which we can explain. Affiliation, which simply means do you belong to a congregation, a JCC, or any Jewish organization? It's a composite, runs in these communities from 50 to 60%. What percent of households give to Jewish cause? Also 60 to 70%. So they're all, again, if we had the national data here, which I didn't want to burden the chart, you would see that many of these numbers, for example, on very important to be Jewish, you would be looking at numbers in the 50% range, not 75, and most of the others would scale down. But let's look at the next slide. When you break this out by the Jews, the groups identified as less connected, these percentages change dramatically. So, for example, 18 to 34 non-Orthodox. If you look at this is just on importance of being Jewish. I just took the first piece of data from the last chart and blew it out for these four groups. But the all Jewish respondents is at the bottom. So if you compare each of these three groups to the overall, you see how much less they are in each of these communities. And again, New York is lower than anybody else, even in terms of the difference. So in Baltimore, I want to point to so you have a range from New York of 34 to Chicago of 71. That's a very big range. Chicago and Cleveland are outliers on this, and I'm going to come back to the Chicago story. There are more young Jews are more likely to be connected in Chicago than any place else that I think we've ever encountered. Intermarried households. So if you look at Baltimore, half of intermarried households say it's very important to be Jewish. These are the Jewish respondents. It would be a little silly to ask a non-Jew how important it is to be Jewish, except theoretically. But what's interesting is you can look at this data, particularly the Baltimore or Cleveland data, and say the glass is half full or half empty. The people who argue that intermarriage is the end for Jews don't find this data doesn't make any sense. Why is someone who's intermarried saying being Jewish is very important? People think intermarriage is going to save the Jews in some bizarre way because it'll increase the number of Jewish households or something else, are looking at enormous numbers of intermarried households who really couldn't care less. And the truth is someplace in between. I find that those percentages reflecting the complexity of life. Intermarriage is a very complicated subject. The most significant thing about it, it is probably not good for the Jews, but on the other hand, it's a reality. And Jewish communities have got to deal, and whatever dealing means. They aren't going away, and none of the percentages are going down. Most are level. It's not necessarily increasing. Jews with no religion, I referred to this overall before, and you have the comparison to all Jewish respondents. We did two kinds of analyses about cost. We looked at the Jewish behaviors of people by income, and we asked them, has cost been an inhibiting factor too? Stuff for your kids, stuff for yourself, and invariably $50,000 a year in America is a break point. People with less than $50,000 income, and we sometimes run this, I don't remember if this data is non-Orthodox. We often run it for non-Orthodox. Orthodox Jews behave differently when it comes to income and doing Jewish. But in general, when we ask, is cost a barrier, significant percentages, people who are in less than $50,000 are much more likely to say that cost is a barrier. In Baltimore and New York, both have very large percentages of Jewish households that are Orthodox. Baltimore and New York, 20% of Jewish respondents, 32% of all people in both communities, huge percentage of the children. But I want to point to the last bullet. And that is that what we found in Baltimore, in New York, and actually in other communities as well, is what we know anecdotally is very strong in the data. Orthodox kids mostly get married before they're 35, and non-Orthodox kids mostly get married after 35. And when you think in terms of community cohesion, and one group is in bars and the other group is pushing baby carriages, problematic. And when you think in terms of Jewish fertility for the non-Orthodox, problematic. And very highly reflected in we don't do fertility measures per se, but if you look at the size of households, the number of kids per household, and you put it together with this data, it's not surprising that non-Orthodox households are not having a lot of kids. They don't have a lot of time. And that's a really, really tough issue for the Jewish community going forward that I really don't think is being faced. I want to say a little bit about Israel. First of all, New York City is the only one of these four communities that has what one would even consider a reasonably sized Israeli-born community. If you count not just people who are born in Israel, but people who have lived in Israel, obviously these percentages go up. In New York, it goes from about 4% to about 6%, but it's still relatively small. We ask a lot of questions about connection to Israel, and again, these are relatively high compared to the national data. Been to Israel nationally would be about 35% in the last study. In these communities, it ranges from 50 to 55%. You'll notice that New York, on these measures, is much more like the other communities than other measures. I believe this is because of the large Russian Jewish community, which is committed to Israel and committed to images of Jewish peoplehood, and that's conjecture. But in general, look at attachment. New York is right in the middle, and a very high correlation, third row, between those who are emotionally attached to Israel and who have been to Israel. I don't know which is the cause and which is the effect, but the correlation is very high. Attachment to Israel among intermarried households is extremely low. Every place except Cleveland, even there it's not very high, and intermarrieds have typically not been to Israel. And I think that's something that people need to work on. I'm fascinated, and don't have a great explanation, that only in Chicago, of all the communities we've ever studied, including these four, the young people tend to identify with conservative or Reformed Judaism at about the same level as older people. If you go to the fourth row down and fifth row down, you'll see that 18 to 39 and 40 to 64 are essentially identical. No other community has that pattern. If we had the other community data on here, younger people are either more likely to be Orthodox or no denomination, no religion. In the middle, it's really going down at a rapid rate. Chicago is the outlier. The last thing I want to put up is one of the things that's in the air in America is people are very nervous, particularly about young people in relation to their attitudes towards Israel, and some communities have tried to probe this. On the other hand, they're reluctant to probe it too hard. Maybe they're afraid of the answer. The question we asked in New York is probably the best of the questions to try to get at the attitudes towards Israel. Do you think most Jewish organizations are too quick to defend Israel against criticism, too slow, or do they handle it about right? We also asked them if it bothered them, whatever their outcome was. And this is an effort to see whether, in fact, are more young people likely to believe that the organizations are too quick to defend Israel. And there is a slight age effect, although most people feel it's about right. We don't think we have the question right yet. We're going to keep trying. Remarkable stability of these older established large Jewish communities, strong overall Jewish engagement with very important exceptions, with major implications for the future, intermarried Jews, Jews with no religion, non-Orthodox young adults, except Chicago. The Orthodox Jewish community is very strong demographically, increasing number of self-identified Jews whose attachment to being Jewish is tenuous, including people who are partially Jewish, somewhat Jewish, I'm not sure, maybe, I'm Jewish with my mother, not with my father. Increasing diversity, I didn't talk about the increasing number of non-white Jews, but they are there, and significant poverty. And an awful lot of this data is online, and there is an earlier version of this report on the North American Jewish Data Bank that has a lot of this data. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Steve is going to present his perspective on these findings and his involvement.
In American Jewry, we have the following situations. We have growth in the fundamentalist sector, which actually leveled out around the year 2000. They're not growing, but growing. We have growth in the non-religious sector. In the Eisenhower years, 3% of Americans said they had no religion. In the most recent studies, 20% of Americans say they have no religion. And here's what else is happening in American Jewry. American Jewry is characterized by trends that we note in our study, in Chapter 4 of the New York study. Hybridity, fluidity, and malleability. These are not pharmaceutical inventions. Hybridity, having dual identities that shouldn't go together. I don't mean like being Jewish and loving the Yankees. I mean something, that Jewish Christian, frankly. Fluidity, flowing in and out. Remember I told you about the 20% who were nuns, not the black and the white, I mean the no religion? Robert Putnam says if you go and ask them next year, 30% of them get religion. And then some others show up. And the ones who get religion just simply relabel. They don't change, they don't start going to shul more often, right? They start putting on tefillin. They just say, all right, today I'm Baptist. And last week I was nothing, and tomorrow, who knows? And so there's and what we see now is more Americans intermarrying. Sounds familiar? More Americans having no religion, more Americans having dual religions or religious in their own identities, more Americans having dual or triple religions in their homes, and more people changing their religious identity through their life, every single one of these, than ever before, than ever before, than ever before. And now we come to the Yidden. So what's going on with the Yidden? That kind of looks like this. Some of this you'll recognize, I'm not going to repeat it. I know we got a lot of headlines with the growth of the Orthodox, but give me a second to just re-emphasize this. 20% of the households of New York are Orthodox. 32% of the people in New York are Orthodox. What about the children? 61% of the children are Orthodox. What about the 5 boroughs of New York? Go up to 74% of the children are Orthodox. There are more Hasidic children than there are conservative and Reformed children put together. I didn't say Orthodox, I said Hasidic children alone exceed all the conservative and all the Reformed put together. Jack spoke about the fertility rate. I'll talk about it. We have weak data on fertility. I could be wrong. We could be wrong. But here's what we got.
Kidding.
I'm going to do it. We got to do it. Hasidim, 6.0. Yeshivish, 5.4. Modern Orthodox, 2.5. Oh, how about everybody else? Yeah, I haven't gotten to the 80% that's not Orthodox. Women, 35 to 44. It appears in our data, 1.3. The 1.3 isn't bad. I just saw a number that American educated women having 1.6. 1.3 isn't totally possible. That's totally possible. Europe has been running 1.2, 1.3 in certain countries. This is not, this is not made up. 2.1 is stability. Understand what's happening here. Oh, and the 1.3 doesn't take into account whether the kids are Jewish. Some of them aren't Jewish. They're not being raised as Jews. They have Jewish parents, but they're not being raised as Jews. So we are talking about a major shift in the composition, at least of New York area Jewry, and some of the other. Baltimore has 20%. So that's on one side. On the other side, Jack and I and the rest of our wonderful colleagues, we discovered a phenomenon that we're now calling the Borderland Jews. Actually, they started out being known as borderline Jews, but it became a little problematic to call all Jews borderline, although there is an argument in favor of that. But basically what happened when Jack and I and others, we commissioned the study, and we have a survey house that works very closely with us. They did 6,300 interviews, 21 minutes on average, with people who all said they were Jewish. And they talk about being Jewish. And then, because we did 6,300, because Federation said, we have a contract that says, give us 6,000 households. So I said, all right, fine. So we do 300 more. The survey house sends back about 600 borderline cases. We're not exactly sure if they're Jewish. You guys decide. So Ron Miller, Jack Ukeles, and Stephen Cohen, under instructions from the Federation Committee about who is a Jew, which includes, by the way, Christians, but not Messianics. And we sit there and we actually discuss each case. We have line by line, we look at it, and we're arguing back and forth. What about case 422? That's Jewish? No, I don't think it's Jewish. And we're deciding, does this person belong to the sample or not belong to the sample? We split it 50-50, more or less. 300 out, 300 in. Why should there be a problem? Who are these people? We later discover the following. We have we operationally now define a borderland Jew as someone who says one of two things. We qualify them as Jewish. They're part of the Jewish now. 13.5% of these Jews said, I'm partially Jewish. They were given the option, and they said, yeah, that's me, I'm partially Jewish. I'll tell you who they are. 5% of Jews in this sample, which is 20% Orthodox, let's understand, 5% said, my religion is something other than Judaism. They'll tell you, the Christianity. I think we had 4 Islamic cases as well. These are people who have another religion, and they say they're Jewish. And who are we to throw them out? Really, the committee says, because there are a lot of Russians who are Christians, so if Russian could be Christian, why not other people? And let me just give you a couple, here hybridity. Huh?
I threw out the Messianic, if you're accepting.
Ata amata. I, as a sociologist, can defend throwing out the Messianics. Why? Because my definition of being Jewish, which may not be the same as yours, is a Jew is someone who says he or she is Jewish, whom many other Jews will accept as Jewish. So the Messianics fail on the last card. How do I know that? Because my committee voted against Messianics. And this this committee of Balabatim from Federation represent the will of the Jewish people. You know, they're the legislators. We merely implement the political level, and I believe it's right. I believe, ideologically, I believe it's right.
There is no Jewish community in the United States that's included Messianics. So far, the theoretical, but the theoretical difference, the theoretical difference, and Stephen can elaborate, is in the case of a Messianic Jew, it's a syncretic situation. They are Jewish because Jesus was a Jew. So their Christianity is inside their Judaism. Someone who says, I'm Jewish and I have another religion, is often, when the surveyor will probe, well, in what way do you, because there's a probe in the interview, in what way do you consider yourself Jewish? Will use in their own words things that say, I'm culturally Jewish, I identify, they don't use these words, but that's what they're saying. I'm culturally Jewish, I identify with the Jewish people, I'm Jewish by nationality, which you can get explicitly from Russians. I'm Jewish by rationality, my religion is other. And, you know, your story.
All right, so now I'll read you some of the comments so you can see what the world we're living in. This is not just New York, although Jack makes a very interesting point that this doesn't happen in Chicago. Hold on. Max, hold on. Let us read these things. Why are you Jewish? If you're a partial or I'm baptized with the Catholic Church. I married a Jewish man. I go to both churches. Listen to the word. Because her husband considers himself Jewish. Besides, she likes Jewish religion and culture. There's a lot here. I'm only picking a few. My ex-husband was Jewish, and my kids are Jewish. Therefore, I'm partially Jewish. This is a great Lebowski. Remember you saw the movie? This, the female version of that. I was born Jewish and years ago converted to Christianity and then practiced Judaism again for my children. I happen to like the religion. I'm married to a Jewish woman and she raised my children Jewish. I'll stop to tell you a story. I have a very good friend who's a scholar of Judaism, major scholar of Judaism. And she's got two boys that went to day school. She's married to a person who was not born Jewish. And I was telling her about this evidence. I said, I bet you so-and-so, whatever his name is, if I told you his name, you might know her. I bet you so-and-so would say that he's partially Jewish. She goes, oh, no. He said he's Jewish. Irish background. And I said, oh, okay, fine. Let me continue. Out of 100 Jews in our sample, seven of them, got it right? This has been a long time. 7 of them have no Jewish parents. So how they become Jewish? 2 of them converted. The other 5 showed up. Hello, ich bin Ayid. And you go, okay. There are Jews by choice, and we created a category called Jews by personal choice. Who made you Jewish? I made me Jewish. Remember I told you about America before? Remember remember Robert Bella? He asked somebody whose name was Sheila, what's your religion? She goes, well, it's a religion of one. It's called Sheilaism. Right? There's a lot of, if there's Sheilaism, Kal v'chama, someone who's married to a Jew, maybe goes to a shul, can say, I'm Jewish. I got two kids that went to day school. They're active in the Jewish community. I'm Jewish. I'm married to a Jewish woman, and I'm raising a child in both religion. And I got 2 more. The rest of my family is Jewish. I just chose another religion. Like, what do you want from me? You know? But I'm still Jewish, right? I just chose a different, but I can do that. And the last one, and Jack actually mentioned this, but this really happened. Are you Jewish? Well, when I'm with my father, I'm Jewish, and when I'm with my mother, I'm Catholic. This is not. You know, I was once talking about some future projections, and Shaul Kellner, who we mentioned, said, Stephen, the future isn't later, the future is now. The future is here. Understand, we're talking about 1 in 7 households, has somebody, like, maybe it could be more, but at least 1 in 7 households in New York have, now who are these people? Where do they come from? They heavily came from, but not only, from mixed married homes. They heavily had no Jewish education. They heavily, they were raised with no religion. They have a lot of no religion, certainly no denomination. on our Jewish identity scale, which is a lot of things that most of you guys would get a 10 or 11 or 12 or who knows a 13. We only have 12 items, so you might get a 13.
No,
Huh?
12 and 11 out of 9.
right. We actually have. I was blown away that in New York we get Seder, you get a point. I have Jewish friends, you get a point. In New York, I think the number was about 16% had zero or one. I find that phenomenal. Pat Moynihan probably got a 7, something like that, right? So these guys are getting zeros and ones, and now, but if you look at the Borderland Jews versus the conventional Jews, a small number, like 13% are getting 0 and 1s, and 58% of the Borderland Jews are getting 0s and 1s. They're hardly Jewish. Not only are they Borderland Jews because of their Jewishness, they're Borderland because of where they live. They live in places where other Jews don't live. We have the whole map of New York area divided up into areas, and then we have residual areas, like they don't belong anywhere, like residual Manhattan, which includes Harlem. 7 to 1, in terms of, they're 7 times more likely to live in Harlem than our conventional Jews. Non-Riverdale Bronx. The Riverdale Bronx? That's where the Jews live? You used to live there? And now we got everything else. That's Borderland Jewish land. Western Queens, across from the you go to one of those Jewish buildings on the Upper East Side. You look across. That's Western Queens, Borderland area. Parts of Eastern Suffolk. I mean, wherever Jews ain't, Jewish Borderland Jews are. Last comment about them: their demographics. They're different. Not only do they live in a different place, but they're who they are. They have lower education, lower income, and there's a general phenomenon that Jews who are demographically different from other Jews have higher rates of intermarriage and so forth. A low-educated man has a higher rate of intermarriage than a high-educated Jewish man. Because low-educated Jewish man is out of the Jewish, is tougher in the Jewish marriage market. Same thing with these people. They're that way. And the last point, Jack mentioned that we had. And it's the first time I think we've asked this question. You've asked this question on the studies about the non-white households.
No,
Households.
The fourth study.
Fourth study you did? Fantastic. So,
All 4 of these.
but I was shocked to learn that 12% of the households has somebody who in some way is either Hispanic or biracial or non-white. We don't know. We didn't know who the person is.
Or
Obviously.
their kids, or their spouse.
Yeah, somebody. So you could have
Somebody
adopted.
in the house.
Could have adopted a Guatemalan kid. That would count. In the Borderland households, it's not 12%. It's 10% in the conventional households, 38% in the Borderland households. So in so many ways, these people are out there and they're different. Last point. What's driving all this? Obviously, aside from America, there's an American influence, but then there's there's a Jewish factor, and it's intermarriage. And I'm back to intermarriage, and in my mind, in the context of low Jewish birth rate and the effect of intermarriage on future Jewish, Jack showed that only a third of the kids of intermarried are being raised as Jews, and you should know they have a very high intermarriage rate in the next generation. It's not like, at least we saved the third. It keeps going downhill. Intermarriage creates and ships out these people who are creates borderland Jews who are highly active in Jewish life, who are reflecting and contributing to the porous boundaries between Jews and non-Jews. Not inherently a good thing or a bad thing, but again, it's a reality, and certainly helping to or reflecting the diminution of the active non-Orthodox Jewish population. I mean, if this is really happening, what I would expect is that we'd hear about significant financial difficulties and layoffs in the reform movement. If this was going on, we'd hear about conservative synagogues merging, about rabbis talking about elderly, an aging population, about the reform movement saying that we need crabbis and ranters. That is, people who combine rabbinic and cantorial role. I just heard this from Stanley Davis, because there aren't going to be jobs for like 2 professionals. We would hear all these things. We would hear about declines in the Shechta movement. We'd hear about declines in the Talmud Torahs, in Hebrew schools, in the conservative and reform movement. We'd hear about declines in youth groups. We would hear about all these things. And you know what? We are hearing these things. It's not, it's not by accident. It's not, we are living. I feel that Jack and I are sitting on top of these data, like Al Gore was standing on top of the ice caps and watching the melting ice caps, and I admit there are some very strong communities, and they're still strong, but I really see, and the ice is still ice, and it's still cold, and there's still polar bears, but the ice is melting. It really is in non-Orthodox Jewry. I really see that getting in touch with this Borderlands, getting in touch with the 1.3, getting in touch with the rising intermarriage rate, which just hit an all-time high in New York for non-Orthodox Jews, creeping upward. 50% of marriages, 1/3 of the Jews in non-Orthodox last 5 years are intermarriages, higher than ever before. It's a new record. We found it in our work.
It's only slightly up.
It's only slightly up.
not up.
So it was close to
Stable.
50% before. That I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
No, it's high,
Froze.
but it's
high.
effectively stable.
It goes like this. Look at our chart. I think that you put all this together, and this is New York. This is not Phoenix. You want to see the end of Jewish life? Go to Phoenix. Go to Phoenix. Go to Las Vegas, and you'll see not Jewish community. You'll see Jewish territory at best. Territory where Jews happen to live. Really, really weak connections. Really, all indicators of communal productivity. That too is part of American Jewry. It's not part of the story that Jack was, illuminated us. So I really think that we're in the middle of cultural creativity and demographic decline at the same time.
Thank you.